Hello, my name is Terry Lynch. I'm an Irish physician, psychotherapist, mental health educator, mental health author, and the provider of a recovery-oriented mental health service. I'm honoured and pleased this June 2018 to be a keynote speaker at the World Annual William Glasser International Conference this year in Colombia. To mark this occasion, I am creating this video of my keynote speech and making it available to the public. In addition, for a limited period, I am making all of my courses, my online courses that is, available at a 50% price reduction. The details of how to obtain this price reduction are in the text just beneath this YouTube video. There are two main themes within this talk. Taking charge, a key component of mental health recovery, and I'm preceding this with an exploration of some home truths about psychiatry. I feel it's important to begin with this, to give a sense of context of the importance of the second aspect here, taking charge as a key component of mental health recovery. My position in relation to mental health globally is that the wrong group, the wrong people, that's medical doctors, are running global mental health. The widespread public trust in psychiatry is misplaced. I'll be providing some examples of that in this talk. And there are major consequences globally as a result. Psychiatry's primary agenda is its own interests, not the public interest. The biologically biased agenda of psychiatry that has dominated global mental health now for 70 years and more is widely claimed to be in the public interest. This is incorrect. It is primarily in psychiatry's interest. I've discussed this in detail as one of the aspects of my online mental health courses, and this is working against the public interest. As a consequence, other promising approaches receive inadequate attention. There are considerable similarities between William Glasser's views and vision and mine. This is illustrated in the fact that I wrote the foreword to Dr. William Glasser's book, Warning: Psychiatry Can Be Hazardous to Your Mental Health. The prevailing approach to mental health worldwide, the medical psychiatric approach, is deluded, fundamentally wrong. It's in a state of chaos that quickly reveals itself when one looks beneath their words, their claims, their pronouncements. Many absurd situations exist within the world of psychiatry in relation to mental health globally, the vast majority of which are created or encouraged by psychiatry. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is accepted widely as the authoritative diagnostic guide to mental disorders. But the DSM has no scientific validity. This reality has been affirmed by many authoritative figures in global mental health, including Dr. Thomas Insel, director of the American National Institute of Mental Health from 2002 to 2015, the National Institute of Mental Health being arguably the most important, influential and powerful mental health institution in the world. Speaking at a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in 2005, Thomas Insel said that the DSM has 0% validity. 0% validity for what is widely accepted as the authoritative diagnostic guide to mental disorders. What is a mental disorder? It's a pretty fundamental question. What is the definition of a mental disorder? The term mental disorders is very important within psychiatry. This is illustrated by the fact that the term is included in the title of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. One might think, therefore, given that the concept of mental disorders is central to psychiatry and the DSM, that psychiatry would be very clear about what the term mental disorder means. This sounds very basic and very fundamental. The major confusion and lack of real expertise that is endemic within psychiatry is illustrated in relation to prominent American psychiatrist Alan Francis, lead psychiatrist of the DSM-4 task force, published in 1994. In 2010, in an interview, Alan Francis said that there is no definition of a mental disorder. It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it. Alan Francis here is referring to a cornerstone of the psychiatric approach, the concept of mental disorder, as bullshit. Remarkable. This major confusion and lack of real expertise emerged in an exchange I had with Dr. Alan Francis on Twitter in 2017. I wrote, "If the DSM is evidence-based, why did lead DSM psychiatrist Alan Francis describe mental disorder as bullshit?" To which Alan Francis replied, "I've read 50 definitions of mental disorder and I've written one. None are helpful. The terms disease, illness and normal are also vague." This is from one of the leading figures within psychiatry globally over the past 40 years or so. Regier, an American psychiatrist, was the vice chair of the DSM-5 task force, the DSM-5 being published in 2013. In 2012, a year before the publication of the DSM-5, Regier wrote that in relation to definitions of mental disorder, broad definition of mental disorder is almost impossible to test. Such major questions about the validity of core themes do not apply to cardiology, respiratory medicine, or any other specialty of medicine. Only within psychiatry, because at a fundamental level, there's really very little verified science within psychiatry. What percentage of the general public are supposedly mentally ill? According to Dr. Gordon Parker, Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New South Wales, Australia, in 2013, Gordon Parker said, "The diagnostic criteria in the manual, that is the DSM-5, that was published in May 2013, are so loose that it will dramatically expand the number of people who could be classified as having a mental illness. That there have been studies showing 50% of the Western population would now generate a DSM diagnosis. Half the population." Gordon Parker is not alone in his concerns. In another 2013 article, Robin Rosenberg, psychologist, wrote, "Beware of the DSM-5, the soon-to-be-released 5th edition of the Psychiatric Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The odds will probably be greater than 50%, according to the new manual, that you'll have a mental disorder in your lifetime." Mainstream psychiatry wants us to believe that what might be described as the psychiatric diagnoses, so-called mental illnesses and mental disorders, are brain disorders. For example, according to the American National Institute of Mental Health, that, as I mentioned previously, is one of the most powerful and influential mental health institutions in the world, mental illnesses are disorders of the brain. Through research, we know that mental disorders are brain disorders. No equivocation here. These sentences are phrased as definite facts, unquestionable, as though arrived at through detailed scientific research. Have you heard this? Is this something you've been aware of? Or if you are a mental health practitioner, have you been taught this? Do you believe this? It wouldn't be surprising if you do believe it, because it's so commonly stated from supposedly authoritative and trustworthy sources, including many doctors in the privacy of the consultation room. I'm often struck how frequently the term "we know" is used within psychiatry and by supposedly authoritative sources within psychiatry, within mental health. I'm struck by it because I know they don't know. As a doctor with 35 years' experience, I know they don't know. I know that they believe or they want to believe that mental disorders are brain disorders, but they don't know this. They can't know it because it isn't scientifically verified. According to medical logic, 50% of the population have a psychiatric diagnosis, as I've just described in the previous slides. And since a common belief and pronouncement in relation to psychiatric diagnoses or mental disorders is that they are brain disorders, it follows that 50% of the population suffer from brain disorders. Does this stand up to logical thinking, logical reasoning? Half the population having a brain disorder? If this were the case, we would be in the throes of a global brain disorder pandemic as never before seen anywhere in the world, ever. A pandemic being an epidemic that is happening all over the world. If so-called mental illnesses or mental disorders really were known brain disorders, as so many psychiatrists and indeed GPs claim, protocol within the medical profession would dictate that these so-called mental illnesses would be investigated and treated by the branch of medicine that specializes in brain disorders. And that branch of medicine is neurology, not psychiatry. According to the medicinenet.com website, the medical definition of neurology is that neurology is the medical specialty concerned with the diagnosis and treatment of disorders of the nervous system, which includes the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. Neurology is the specialty concerned with disorders of the brain. This is quite clear here, and quite clear within well-recognized definitions of neurology. The World Health Organization, in 2016, in answer to the question, "What are neurological disorders and how many people are affected by them?" wrote on their official website, "Neurological disorders are diseases of the central and peripheral nervous system. In other words, the brain, spinal cord, cranial nerves, peripheral nerves, nerve roots, autonomic nervous system, neuromuscular junction, and muscles." This is a pretty comprehensive, though succinct, explanation of what neurology is, of what neurological disorders are. The World Health Organization goes on to list many examples of neurological disorders. These disorders include epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, cerebrovascular diseases such as stroke, migraine and other headache disorders, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, neuroinfections, in other words, infections within the nervous system, brain tumours, traumatic disorders of the nervous system due to head trauma, and neurological disorders as a result of malnutrition. Do you see any reference to any psychiatric diagnosis, such as depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, etc.? No, me neither. The World Health Organization continues, "Hundreds of millions of people worldwide are affected by neurological disorders. And in relation to the major numbers of people affected by neurological disorders, they list some of the most common neurological disorders that affect so many people. These include stroke, epilepsy, dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, which is a form of dementia, and migraine. Again, not a word here about any psychiatric diagnosis, any so-called mental disorder. As you can see, this simply does not add up. If up to 50% of the general population really suffered from a mental illness, and if so-called mental illnesses really were brain disorders, then clearly, given the claimed frequency of mental disorders, then we would see, in addition to the listed brain disorders we see here, we would inevitably see depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, other psychiatric diagnoses, specifically named within this World Health Organization reply to a question. The fact that there's no mention of them speaks volumes. And the reason, quite simply, is that psychiatric diagnoses, so-called mental disorders, are not known brain disorders. If so-called mental illnesses, mental disorders really were known brain disorders, they would be included in comprehensive lists of brain disorders. Of course they would. Including the following: the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, a sister organisation of the aforementioned National Institute of Mental Health, contains a very comprehensive list of brain and neurological disorders, the most comprehensive list I've ever seen, which includes dozens of disorders that are so rare that I have never heard of them in 35 years as a medical doctor. The respected WebMD website also has a comprehensive list of brain disorders. And the Australian-based Brain Foundation website contains an extensive list of brain disorders. Not a single psychiatric diagnosis is included in any of these lists. Why? Quite simple, really. None of these so-called mental illnesses, mental disorders, are known, established brain disorders. If they were, they would clearly and obviously be included in these lists. The Bipolar Focus website provides some examples of the widespread misinformation that originates from supposedly authoritative sources and trustworthy sources. Bipolar Focus website contains an article entitled Bipolar Disorder Facts and Statistics, within which it is stated, bipolar disorder is a very serious but highly treatable brain disease. There is no cure for bipolar disorder. If the appropriate level of investment is made in biological and genetic brain research, it has been estimated that a cure for bipolar disorder could be found within 10 years. Traditionally, however, bipolar disorder has only received a small fraction of the amount of medical research dollars that go into serious physical, non-brain diseases. The title of this article is Bipolar Disorder Facts and Statistics. But none of these are facts. Not a single one. As I've discussed, neither bipolar disorder or any other so-called mental disorder is a known brain disease. The impression given here is that nobody recovers from bipolar disorder. This is simply untrue. I personally know over 36 people who've made excellent recoveries from a diagnosis of bipolar disorder which met psychiatry's criteria for bipolar disorder. Regarding the statement, if the appropriate level of investment is made in biological and genetic brain research, it has been estimated that a cure for bipolar disorder could be found within 10 years, by the year 2013. Well, it's now 2018, and psychiatry is no nearer finding a cure for bipolar disorder than it was when this article was written 15 years ago. It's interesting too that the two types of research mentioned here are biological and genetic brain research. And genetic brain research is biological also. So again, we see the enormous bias within psychiatry, within the medical profession, and indeed within mental health research towards biology. No consideration of the potential, the enormous potential of psychological research. So this statement is clearly not a fact. Can you spot the flaw in the sentence, traditionally, however, bipolar disorder has only received a small fraction of the amount of medical research dollars that go into serious physical, non-brain diseases? This sentence looks innocent, but it's quite disingenuous. Reading this, you might conclude, that's a very reasonable statement. Why shouldn't brain diseases be researched to the same degree as, say, heart diseases or respiratory diseases? But this is disingenuous, because the fact is that brain diseases, brain disorders, receive a great deal of research. Enormous amounts of research go into brain disorders, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, known brain disorders. This is no different to any other specialty of medicine. Quite deceiving, this sentence, because it's implying two things. It's implying two things that are not true. One, that bipolar disorder is a brain disease, which it isn't. And secondly, that brain disease research is grossly neglected, which it isn't. But it's a clever strategy because it brings people on board. People reading this would naturally think, gosh, that's really wrong, yeah, there should be a lot more research. A huge amount of research has gone into bipolar disorder over the past 50, 60 years in an attempt to establish brain and biological abnormalities. All this research has failed, and there is no current evidence of any characteristic biological abnormalities in relation to bipolar disorder or any other psychiatric diagnosis. Brain chemical imbalances in mental disorders. Have you heard of brain chemical imbalances in mental disorders? Have you heard this being said? Were you taught about brain chemical imbalances in mental disorders if you were a mental health professional? Do you believe that there are brain chemical imbalances in so-called mental disorders? Which of the following have you heard most described as chemical imbalance illnesses? Thyroid disease, hypothyroidism and underfunctioning thyroid, and hyperthyroidism and overfunctioning thyroid, depression, diabetes, gout, bipolar disorder, Addison's disease, disease of the adrenal glands, a disease that former American President John F. Kennedy suffered from. I think it's likely that the two that you would most have heard described as chemical imbalance illnesses here would be depression and bipolar disorder. Which of the following are not chemical imbalance illnesses? The same list. Two of these are not known chemical imbalance illnesses, and these are depression and bipolar disorder. All of the others have at the heart of the problem an established imbalance of a chemical within the body. It's interesting that of these, the two that are most proclaimed to be chemical imbalances are not chemical imbalances. Dr. Nancy Andreasen, American psychiatrist, has been one of the most influential psychiatrists of the past 40 to 50 years. She was awarded the National Medal of Science in 2000 by American President Bill Clinton for her work in relation to mental health. In 1984, her book, The Broken Brain, The Biological Revolution in Psychiatry, was published. This was a major seller and became a highly influential book, fostering and encouraging global focus on a biological approach to mental health. In this book she wrote, "The various forms of mental illnesses are due to the many different types of brain abnormalities, including the loss of nerve cells and excesses and deficits in chemical transmission between neurons." In other words, in relation to the last line here, chemical imbalances. She continued, "In relation to why one person might apparently respond to one so-called antidepressant and another person might not and instead respond to a different antidepressant," she wrote, "One person suffers from a serotonin deficiency in the brain, while the other suffers from a norepinephrine deficiency, norepinephrine being called noradrenaline in many countries." She spoke of the need for medication to correct the underlying chemical imbalance. Many other well-known and high-profile psychiatrists have been promoting the idea of brain chemical imbalances as a known fact for years. Dr. Daniel Amen, again an American psychiatrist, in his 1999 book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, wrote, "Depression is known, my emphasis, to be caused by a deficit of certain neurochemicals or neurotransmitters, especially norepinephrine, which as I mentioned is often known as noradrenaline in many countries, and serotonin." Daniel Amen was described as the most popular psychiatrist in America in 2012. Dr. Richard Harding, American psychiatrist, at a time when he was president of the American Psychiatric Association, wrote in 2001 in the Family Circle magazine, "We now know that mental illnesses, such as depression or schizophrenia, are not moral weaknesses or imagined, but real diseases caused by abnormalities of brain structure and imbalances of chemicals in the brain." Family Circle magazine has been a highly popular magazine for many years, with an average readership of 16 million per month. These are just three of the many influential psychiatrists who have been promoting the notion of brain chemical imbalances as a known fact, misinforming millions upon millions of people in America and also around the world. There is another major problem here within Richard Harding's words, though the average person may not spot it. Whether deliberately or not, Richard Harding here has presented a false dilemma, or perhaps more accurately, a false trilemma. He's only given three options: so-called mental illnesses as moral weaknesses, as imagined, or as real diseases. The first two of these, moral weaknesses and imagined, have a pejorative feel to them. Nobody would want to think that their issues, their problems are moral weaknesses or imagined. So when just these three options are presented, it makes the third option, real diseases, far more attractive to people, a relief from the other two quite unattractive options. The truth is that there are other ways to understand the experiences and behaviours that come to be described as mental illnesses, as I will discuss later in this presentation and in my workshop. The facts in relation to brain chemical imbalances are: no brain chemical imbalances have ever been verified for any so-called mental illness. Therefore, it is completely inappropriate to speak of brain chemical imbalances and correcting brain chemical imbalances when no such brain chemical imbalances have been demonstrated as existing, which is why none of the millions of people who have been told they have a brain chemical imbalance have had their so-called brain chemical imbalance confirmed by any tests. There are no known such brain chemical imbalances, and there are no laboratory or clinical tests that confirm the presence of any such brain chemical imbalances. In 2017, in a tweet, a counsellor asked a question of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. The counsellor asked, "What is the evidence that depression is due to a chemical imbalance in the brain?" I have clients who believe this. The Royal College of Psychiatrists replied, "Hi there. The old idea that antidepressants correct a chemical imbalance in the brain is an oversimplification, and we do not support this view. The truth is that up to 2007, the Royal College of Psychiatrists did support this view very enthusiastically, and in 2006-2007, the Royal College of Psychiatrists began to realise that promoting a chemical imbalance idea not only was not sustainable, it never was sustainable, but that critics of this notion had become so informed that this notion of chemical imbalance was now becoming an embarrassment for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. So they removed the vast majority of references to chemical imbalances from their websites and from their information. Interestingly, they did this quietly. They didn't inform anybody of this major change at the time. Most likely, again, because this would have been quite embarrassing to have to acknowledge and admit that A, there wasn't any scientific validation to this idea, and secondly, that there never had been any scientific validation for this idea, and that the Royal College of Psychiatrists should never have been enthusiastic about this notion and promoting it as a known fact, when in truth it never was a known fact. So the words of this very prominent psychiatrist, Nancy Andreasen, are quite simply wrong, misinformation. As are the words of Dr. Daniel Amen. Dr. Richard Harding is also completely incorrect here. This is not a matter of opinion. This is quite simply misinformation. In emotional and mental health, the medical radar is rigidly set to pick up what the medical profession wants to be there, that is not actually there. Brain biological abnormalities that are not verified to be there. The medical radar regularly picks up a distortion and a misinterpretation of what is actually there. what is going on within the person, missing key aspects of what is going on, what is there. Key aspects of these people and of their experiences and behaviours. This deluded thinking, and it is deluded, is by design. It's not accidental. The continuing supremacy of the medical model in global mental health depends on maintaining this delusion. These are just some of the reasons why psychiatry is not working and cannot work, and why psychiatry in its current form must be replaced. There urgently needs to be a paradigm shift in the public interest. Many of the principles and themes of choice theory, reality therapy, are highly relevant in relation to the psychiatric diagnoses, so-called mental illnesses, including what are described as depression, general anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, eating disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorder, personality disorders, and schizoaffective disorder. Given that 50% of the population supposedly have a diagnosable mental disorder, as I discussed earlier, this really matters. Relevant choice theory, reality theory, principles and themes include needs, the basic needs, as considered within choice theory: power, love and belonging, freedom, fun, and survival. Doing, sometimes described as the heart of reality therapy, the key issue of control, choice, reality, and the present, the now, and many other principles and themes of choice theory, reality therapy are highly relevant. One of the suggested criteria for keynote speakers by the William Glasser Institute for this international conference was connect the ideas to wellness and effectiveness with internal control psychology. I felt very comfortable with this criterion because a greatly reduced sense of internal control is generally a fundamental feature within the vast majority of people who are given psychiatric diagnoses. In my book, Selfhood, A Key to the Recovery of Emotional Wellbeing, Mental Health and the Prevention of Mental Health Problems, I refer to this as healthy self-centeredness. Person living and being and feeling themselves solid and strong at the center of their personal space, within their boundary, like a pilot in the cockpit of a plane, with all of the controls at arm's length, within reach. A common characteristic of people given psychiatric diagnoses is that their sense of self is greatly reduced, an important aspect of which is what I refer to as self-referral. Greatly reduced. Who do I check with? Where do I primarily look to for direction and in relation to choice-making and decision-making within my life? A greatly reduced sense of agency, feeling empowered to make things happen as one needs to, and a greatly reduced sense of internal control, which, in my experience, is linked to what we might describe as sovereignty, a very important reality in my experience. The English Oxford Dictionary defines sovereignty as supreme power or authority, the authority of a state to govern itself or another state, a self-governing state. Sovereignty also applies to individual. The authority and the right of an individual to govern themselves. Sovereignty within psychiatric diagnoses is very important because it's a reality. People are sovereign, and like the elephant in the room, it is often missed completely, with considerable consequences. The widespread failure to grasp the importance of sovereignty compromises the ability to help, since sovereignty is an important reality within the framework of a person's situation. Sovereignty needs to be identified and worked with, rather than missed, ignored, or worked against, which is often the case, regrettably, within psychiatry, within mental health services. Understanding sovereignty is very useful when working with people who've been given a psychiatric diagnosis. Setting out to understand how a client perceives and utilizes their sovereignty within their life, regardless of the psychiatric they have been given prior to attending me, has been such a helpful aspect of my work. An aspect of understanding the person's inner world, how they think, feel, patterns and themes within how they think and feel and act within the world. Understanding a person's inner world is a cornerstone of effective work, in my opinion and my experience. And this again is one of the reasons why psychiatry is fundamentally quite ineffective, because within psychiatry very little effort is made to understand the person's inner world, to understand and make sense of how this person thinks, feels and operates within the world. I have learned and I have observed, when a person attends me, having already been given a psychiatric diagnosis, that person has generally played a considerable part in the creation and maintenance of their particular set of experiences and behaviors. This is true for all of the main so-called mental illnesses. Rather than living from a solid, self-centered platform, living moment to moment with a trusted locus of internal control, most people who reach the point where they are given a psychiatric diagnosis have retreated and withdrawn within their being, as if into a corner of themselves, a corner of their space, and their sense of having internal control like the pilot with all of the controls in the cockpit within arm's reach, is greatly reduced. Having a lack of internal locus of control contributes greatly to many of the experiences and behaviors that doctors misinterpret as symptoms of so-called mental disorders. For example, many of the experiences and behaviors that are medically categorized as schizophrenia are examples of reduced internal locus of control. For example, a client who used to attend me with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. Through the eyes of the medical profession, this diagnosis was justified. This person had had many psychiatric admissions in relation to these experiences and behaviors. One day he said to me, "I look at people's faces when I walk down the street. If they look left, something terrible is going to happen to me. If they look right, I'm not in big trouble, at least for the moment." This man had within his life, indeed many years before such experiences developed within him, had greatly lost a sense of self, including a sense of having a trusted, reliable locus of internal control. And as he walked down the street, he repeatedly looked at people's faces, as I've just described. Understandably, he wasn't aware that what he was doing was projecting his own lack of internal control, lack of sense of self, onto the other person, like a boomerang, and having this reflected back to him as if coming from the other person, whereas it was originating from himself, as if he was firing it out onto the screen of life, in this case, onto the people on the street. What was coming back to him were his own issues, his own fears, his own insecurity, his own sense of defenselessness, which of course goes hand in hand with not having a solid and trusted internal locus of control. This man has made a complete recovery. He's been completely recovered for over 10 years, off all medication for over 10 years. Just one of many people with whom I've worked who had a legitimate diagnosis of schizophrenia. Legitimate in the sense that the person's experiences and behaviours met the medical criteria for this diagnosis, who have made very good recoveries. We see the world not as it is, but as we are conditioned to see the world, and indeed as we have conditioned ourselves to see the world. What we see out there in the world is generally a reflection, a projection of our mindset, the lenses through which we see the world. And in these words, this man was describing how he perceived people. His mindset could accurately be described as, I have no power, they have all the power. I cannot protect myself, I am at their mercy. They could really harm me. He really had no sense of having an internal locus of control, and he was repeatedly projecting this mindset onto the screen of life and experiencing life through this mindset. Therefore, if I do not have a solid sense of inner knowing, of inner locus of control, of internal locus of control, like the pilot in the cockpit, an inner felt sense of sovereignty within my world, this greatly affects how I see and experience the world, the lenses through which I see and experience the world. With this mindset, I am bound to experience struggles on an ongoing basis as I try in my own ways to engage with the world as best I feel I can. This is a recurring theme within people who are given a diagnosis of a so-called mental illness. This pattern of shrinking within one's space, retreating into a corner of oneself because being at the center doesn't feel safe. It's too overwhelming, too risky. Has been evident in virtually every case, every person I have met and worked with who has received a diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anorexia, borderline personality disorder, schizoaffective disorder, and in most cases of anxiety, what doctors refer to as generalized anxiety disorder, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Let's take a look at what is described as bipolar disorder. Said to affect up to 2% of the adult population, psychiatrists tend to focus primarily on the highs, or the so-called manic state, and the lows, the so-called depressive state. Within psychiatry, there's very little focus on the in-between state, how a person is between episodes. This is most unfortunate because I have found that there's great potential to work in this in-between state. We could say that for many people, their ongoing state of being is relaxed, spontaneous, content, peaceful, having an internal locus of control, empowered, quietly confident. We might describe this as common enough ongoing experience for people, a good, perhaps an ideal way of being as one goes about one's life. People who find themselves receiving a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, they are not in this position. Their in-between ongoing state is not in this balanced, relatively peaceful state. Rather, they tend to be towards extremes. For example, tense, on guard, hesitant and unsure, quite unhappy, restless within their lives, and having little sense of internal control over their lives, feeling quite powerless, or overextended into other people's spaces and boundaries, allowing other people to invade their own space on a regular basis, again unhappy, restless and perhaps reckless, again little sense of internal control, towards the other extreme. Being off-center, ungrounded in these ways, the possibility of them edging towards the extremes of a manic state and of a depressive state, become more possible. I discuss this in great detail in my online courses, particularly my Working Therapeutically with Clients with a Psychiatric Diagnosis course and my Bipolar Disorder Cracking the Code course. In relation to lack of internal locus of control, other terms we might use are a lack of self-empowerment, lack of perceived and experienced agency within one's world. And these are fundamental experiences within people who find themselves diagnosed with bipolar disorder. They are fundamental to the highs, the manic episodes, and to the so-called lows, the depressive episodes. Lacking confidence in oneself, one's sovereignty, in having an internal locus of control makes these episodes far more likely. I discuss and set all of this out in detail in my Working Therapeutically with Clients with a Psychiatric Diagnosis online course and my Bipolar Disorder Cracking the Code online course. Another example of the centrality of a lack of internal locus of control in the so-called psychiatric diagnoses, mental disorders. A client, female in her early 30s, she'd received a diagnosis of depression for over 5 years, and she was taking substances that have come to be called antidepressants. Prior to attending me, she was reading my book, Selfhood, and she came across the word schizophrenia in the book. She became very anxious that she might have schizophrenia, and on her first attendance to me, much of the time was spent exploring her fears around having schizophrenia. This person, as is typical in such situations, had little or no sense of internal locus of power and control within her life. We could say that she was not inhabiting herself, her space fully. Being at the centre, the pilot in the cockpit, was too risky for her. It was too scary, too risky to have all that power. So, like so many others, within her own space she had retreated, shrunken herself and retreated, as a purposeful coping strategy. Her focus and her reliance, her dependence, if you like, was on other people, not on herself. Having no confidence about who she is, she had no confidence or sense of clarity about who she is not. One day, it might be, oh my God, could I have schizophrenia? And tomorrow, some other fear or terror or dread. If I don't know who I am, if I haven't a solid sense of myself within my world, then it's very hard for me to know who I am not. Through our work together, this woman has arrived at a much clearer sense of who she is, and therefore of who she is not. She has experienced many and major benefits in her daily life, within her relationships, as a product of our work, of having a far greater locus of control. She's now off all medication and experiencing greatly reduced anxiety. Living without internal locus of control is like living at the centre of a never-ending storm. In relation to the experiences and behaviours that come to be called depression, the American Psychiatric Association and the vast majority of so-called authoritative sources convey the message that depression is something you have, that you suffer from, that depression is something a person has, suffers from. Depression is presented as a noun, indicating that it's a real thing, a real entity, something that happens to you, over which you have no power, choice, or input. For example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists speaks of 1 in 10 people who suffer from serious depression. Dr. William Glasser described this in a different way. He would say that you are depressing, a verb indicating that there's a degree of choosing, of sovereignty involved, that the person is wielding or exercising their will, their power, their choices by depressing themselves. This is correct. The person is the chooser of these behaviours, of these actions. The person is the one with the power. Even if they have disconnected, reached a point within their lives that they feel they are powerless, that is how they feel, how they perceive themselves, they still nevertheless are powerful. They are the ones with the power within their lives. In conclusion, taking charge is a key component of the process of recovery. Psychiatry regularly works against this, increasing external dependence, external reliance, dependence and reliance on them, on psychiatrists and doctors, and on the substances they prescribe, which they refer to as medication. Choice theory, reality therapy has much to offer. I will be exploring this and related themes further in my workshop at this conference.